The gentlewoman from Washington, Mrs. Rodgers, and the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone. Each will control 30 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Washington, Mrs. Rodgers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks on the legislation and to insert extraneous material on H.R. 22.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of H.R. 22, the Protecting America's Strategic Petroleum Reserve from China Act. America is suffering through the worst energy crisis in decades. President Biden and the Democrats' radical rush to green agenda is making life unaffordable for people all across this country. It's driving record inflation, straining household budgets, and weakening our electric grid. Under President Biden and the Democrats' control of China, gas prices rose to the highest levels in history. Some were forced to pay more than $6 per gallon. Gas prices are still 40% higher today. Diesel prices are up almost $2 a gallon, more than when President Biden took office. The federal government should not be in the business of picking winners and losers, especially when it makes us more dangerously dependent upon China for critical minerals, solar panels, and batteries to produce our own energy and electricity, and strengthens Russia and OPEC's grip on world oil and gas markets. Now, to cover up his failed policies driving our energy and inflation crisis, President Biden drained our nation's strategic petroleum reserve at an alarming rate. America's strategic petroleum reserve, once the world's largest stockpile, has been depleted to the lowest level since 1983. President Biden released an unprecedented 250 million barrels of oil in less than 2 years, more than all former presidents combined. And as we know, much of that oil went to China because our refineries and pipelines are full. It now has nowhere to go here. In April, the Biden administration sold 1 million barrels directly to a state-owned Chinese company. Millions more barrels went to overseas traders who eventually sent it to China. We also know that China is ramping up its purchases of crude oil from Russia and the U.S. to boost its own reserves. China now controls the world's largest government-controlled stockpile of oil, with almost 1 billion barrels, at the expense of American taxpayers and our energy security. America's strategic petroleum reserve is meant for true energy supply disruptions, like those caused by hurricanes and natural disasters, not to help China. Draining our strategic reserves for political purposes and selling portions of it to China is a significant threat to our national security. The administration is not just hurting our own ability to respond to emergencies and national security events. They are actively bolstering the oil reserves of our most dangerous geopolitical adversary, the Chinese Communist Party. This is unacceptable and it must stop. I urge my colleagues to support this bill and prohibit the sale and export of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve crude oil to China. H.R. 22 prevents the Secretary of Energy from selling any products from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to any entity owned under the control or the influence of the CCP, or selling to any other entity that intends to export to China. Enacting H.R. 22, preventing the Biden administration from wasting our strategic reserves, is the first step towards flipping the switch and unleashing American energy production. America has led the world in reducing carbon emissions and promoting innovation by utilizing our abundant, clean, affordable, and reliable energy. We can restore this leadership without sacrificing our energy security or making everyday life unaffordable for people. That starts by enacting smart, workable, all of the above strategies that build on this legacy by lowering cost and emissions across the country. It includes our infrastructure and electricity grid, making it more resilient, unleashing innovation for cleaner natural gas, emissions-free hydropower and nuclear power, and carbon capture technologies. Republicans support a level playing field with a balance of energy sources, but without handing the keys of our energy future over to the Chinese Communist Party. It's time to cut the red tape, expand energy production here at home, modernize our infrastructure, invest in new technologies, and create opportunities for jobs and economic development right here in the United States of America. I look forward to passage of this bill today, and I'm eager to get to work with my colleagues on additional solutions to make energy cleaner, more affordable, and more reliable for all Americans. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlelady from Washington reserves. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as it may consume.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, let me first begin by congratulating the gentlewoman from Washington State on her election as the chairman of the Energy, or chairwoman, I should say, of the Energy and Commerce Committee. I rise in opposition to H.R. 22, the Protecting America's Strategic Petroleum Reserve from China Act. First, let's take a moment to remember how we got here. In 2015, when Republicans last controlled Congress, they lifted the 40-year ban on crude oil exports at the urging of their big oil friends. This irresponsible policy change allowed companies to export American-owned barrels of oil to our adversaries, including China. Again, that was a Republican policy pushed by House Republicans 8 years ago. And as a result, our crude oil exports to China surged, averaging $500 million every day during the last year of the Trump administration. China hoarded these barrels to build up its own petroleum reserves. So back in 2015, I strongly opposed that Republican bill out of concern that it would harm our energy security and ultimately lead to increased prices at the pump for hardworking American families. And it turns out I was right. And now Republicans seem to be complaining about the very circumstances that they created, all to reward their big oil friends. Lifting the export ban damaged our economic security. Refineries across the country, including in my home state of New Jersey, have closed since the export ban was lifted, in no small part due to oil companies' desires to seek greater profits abroad rather than send their oil to refineries here at home. A GAO analysis in 2020 showed that domestic refineries suffered because of the export ban being lifted, a suffering that was then inflicted on the thousands of hardworking Americans whose jobs were destroyed. Now, if Republicans were serious about addressing this issue, they would have brought forward a bill that banned all exports of oil to crude oil to China. Spro barrels sold to Chinese firms represented only 2% of all the oil we sent to China last year, only 2% from the Spro. If we truly want to address China using American oil to build its reserves, let's actually take a serious look at that rather than skirt around the issue because Republicans are scared of big oil's wrath. And why are Republicans only banning Spro sales to China? Representatives Houlihan and Bacon introduced a bill last Congress that prohibited Spro sales to Russia, North Korea, Iran, and any country under U.S. sanctions. That bill had 37 bipartisan co-sponsors. Are my Republican colleagues okay with exporting oil to Putin's Russia in the midst of a war on Ukraine? It also speaks volumes, Mr. Speaker, that this is their first energy priority after regaining the House majority. Over the last 2 years, Democrats passed the most significant climate law in our nation's history. We also passed the bipartisan infrastructure law that will modernize our energy infrastructure. But Republicans' first energy bill this Congress isn't about investing in the resiliency of our electric grid or making American energy cleaner and cheaper. Instead, they're just recycling an old one-page bill that takes a minor step in undoing the damage that they themselves created. Republicans are here today denying their own history and muddying the truth by trying to place the blame on President Biden. But President Biden successfully used the Spro to lower prices at the pump and provide relief to American families. When gas prices increased last year, the Biden administration took decisive action to bring gas prices back down by releasing oil from the Spro. The administration released an unprecedented 1 billion barrels of oil a day, providing critical domestic supply to make up for shortages in the aftermath of the war in Ukraine. This was a common-sense strategy that worked, and thanks largely to President Biden's actions, gasoline prices have fallen an average of $1.90 per gallon nationwide since their peak in June. But one thing that this episode underscores is that fossil fuel prices are volatile. As long as we rely on gasoline and other fossil fuels to meet America's energy needs, our country's energy security and affordability remains at the whims of dictators like Putin on the other side of the world. While I agree, just like I did back in 2015, that we should not export U.S. crude oil to China, I want to stress that this bill could have been improved through bipartisan cooperation, regular order, and committee consideration. If Republicans hope to actually enact legislation, this is not a pathway to success. And I reserve the balance of my time, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from New Jersey reserves. The gentlelady from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to yield a minute to the gentleman, Leader on Energy, Dr. Burgess.
Gentleman is recognized.
And I thank the chairwoman for yielding, and I do want to speak in support of protecting America's Strategic Petroleum Reserve from China Act. Mr. Speaker, the Republican majority is wasting no time in making good on our commitment to the American people to reverse this reckless agenda that the Biden administration has followed. Republicans understand that energy policy is foundational to a thriving and dynamic national economy, and too long we've watched as Democrats' energy policy was kind of an experiment for their radical agenda, and unfortunately, they hurt the American people in the process. Now, interestingly, in July of 2020, Senator Cornyn and I had a bill to allow filling the Strategic Petroleum Reserve while prices were at historic lows. It was blocked by the Democrats. They wouldn't even consider it. Now, today, we have an opportunity to protect America's resource, refill a Strategic Petroleum Reserve so it can be used as it was originally intended to protect our people at times of crisis. I thank the gentlelady. I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlelady reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 3 minutes now to the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Castor, who chaired our Climate Action Special Committee in the last Congress.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Well, I thank Chairman Pallone for yielding the time. You know, America should not be exporting our crude oil exports to an adversary. And that was our national policy for 40 years until a Republican-controlled Congress authorized sending American crude oil abroad in 2015. China exploited that ill-advised policy change, and exports of American crude oil to China increased nearly 100-fold during the Trump administration to about 391 million barrels. Last year, in response to soaring gasoline prices caused by Putin's unprovoked attack on Ukraine, President Biden successfully used the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to lower prices at the pump and provide relief to American families. This was a common-sense strategy that worked. Gasoline prices have fallen an average of $1.90 per gallon nationwide since their peak last June. However, we cannot keep relying on the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to keep oil prices in check. That's why Democrats have focused on lowering cost and avoiding price spikes through the Inflation Reduction Act, because cleaner, cheaper energy is our future. It will lower costs, create good-paying jobs, and help us build safer, more resilient, and healthier communities. Plus, this bill is way too narrowly tailored. What we should be debating today is the far-sighted bill offered by my colleagues, Congresswoman Chrissy Houlihan and Congressman Don Bacon, a bipartisan bill that would completely ban all crude oil exports to China. That is a much stronger bill. It would ban, in addition to China, it would ban crude oil exports to all of our adversaries, including Iran, North Korea. But in the end, America's future is in clean energy. That's how we're going to lower the cost of energy for American families, provide good-paying jobs, and make sure that we provide a livable planet to our kids and future generations. I appreciate the gentleman, and I congratulate Ms. McMorris Rodgers for taking the gavel of the Energy and Commerce Committee and look forward to working with her in the 118th Congress. I yield back my time.
Gentlelady yields back.
According to Russia, North Korea.
Gentleman from New Jersey, reserve.
President Biden wants to import from. Yeah, Russia. Did I say that? North Korea is not so much.
Gentlelady from
Thank you,
Washington
Mr. Speaker. the lady suggested that we should be banning exports to Russia, North Korea, and Iran. I might just note that President Biden has actually wanted to import from Russia and Iran. Pleased to yield to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Latta, 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of the Protecting America's Strategic Petroleum Reserve from China Act, legislation offered by my good friend, the gentlelady from Washington State, and the chair of the Energy and Commerce Committee. Over the first 2 years of the Biden administration, we have seen an unprecedented level of hostility toward America's energy producers. The administration has made every effort to undermine, avoid, and restrict oil and gas production in North America, while at the same time moving to drain our strategic reserves in an attempt to offset the price increases caused by the president's own policies. Playing politics with the Strategic Petroleum Reserve has resulted in the lowest level it has been in decades. If this wasn't alarming enough, just wait until you hear who has benefited from our reserves being drained, the Chinese Communist Party. As part of this administration's Strategic Petroleum Reserve, sales, a little under 1 million barrels, were bought by Unipec, a Chinese petrochemical corporation. This short-sightedness shows the Biden administration is willing to put our national security at risk by selling vital reserves to our adversaries to manipulate market prices in hopes of gaining political advantage. This is not right, and every single member of this body should be opposed to such actions. And while we investigate these actions, we must ensure they never happen again. That is why I'm proud to be an original co-sponsor to Protecting America's Strategic Petroleum Reserve from China Act. This bill would prevent the Secretary of Energy from selling any products from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to any entity owned or under the control or influence of the Chinese Communist Party or to any other entity that intends to export products to China. I urge my colleagues to support this important legislation, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlelady reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 3 minutes now to the gentleman from California, member of our committee and a leader on environmental issues, Mr. Peters.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My Republican colleagues have promised to secure America's energy future. I share this goal, and I'm eager to work together. And again, congratulations to our new chair. However, I would say that the path to energy security is not through cheap political rhetoric or Biden bashing, but through bipartisan policy solutions. We all agree that oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve should not be sold to our adversaries. And to prevent this, Representatives Chrissy Houlihan of Pennsylvania and Don Bacon of Nebraska introduced the bipartisan Banning Oil Exports to Foreign Adversaries Act last July and reintroduced it yesterday with 34 Democratic and 7 Republican co-sponsors. The bill prevents the sale or export of oil from the SPR to China, but also North Korea, Russia, Iran, and any country currently under U.S. sanctions. I bet it would be approved by voice vote in this House today. By contrast, the bill we're debating today only prohibits SPR sales to entities affiliated with China. Given that a more comprehensive bipartisan bill already exists, why would our colleagues be putting forward a more partisan bill with a partial solution that won't pass the Senate? Let me be clear. Americans are looking for serious policy results, not half-baked ideas designed for a press release. And if my colleagues across the aisle are serious about energy independence, let's talk about that. They'll have to acknowledge that our path to true energy security is not by doubling down on oil. We've seen the costs of oil price shocks time and time again. In the 1970s, the Arab oil embargo caused oil prices to soar. In 1990, the first Gulf War spiked record prices. In 2005, Hurricane Katrina damaged refining facilities, causing prices to rise again. Between December 2007 and July 2008, prices rose from $118 a barrel to over $160 per barrel before crashing during the Great Recession. And in the last few years, we've seen rapid volatility from negative prices during the pandemic to over $100 a barrel during the recovery. It's becoming very clear that we have to admit that doubling down on oil is a failed strategy, and true energy security will be achieved by reducing our reliance on fossil fuels and investing in clean fuels of the future. Let's do that for our taxpayers as well as for the environment. and I look forward to working together on real solutions, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman reserves. Gentlelady from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Guthrie.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to kind of clarify, Russia and Iran, well, Iran's part of OPEC, so they're not the ones buying out of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Matter of fact, President Biden went to OPEC to ask them to increase their production instead of doing American oil. And I also want to say 2015, to finish the sentence, they said the Republican-controlled Congress in 2015, it was also the Obama administration worked together in a bipartisan way to unleash American energy or give them a worldwide market for American energy, that when you threw in the President Trump's administration and a regulatory environment that made sense, we had record production of energy. We did ship it throughout the world. We also had record low prices here in America. So the problem we're facing today is because of President Biden and the Democrats in Congress' war on American oil. That's the problem we're here to address. The price of gasoline hit over $5 a gallon in the height of this war on oil, $4.80 a gallon in Kentucky when it was just over $2.20-something cents when President Biden took office. American families are hurting because of this. Small business owners are hurting because of this, and they continue to struggle. And instead of taking action to meaningfully unleash Americans' energy potential, President Biden opted to release supplies from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. And what we need to do is get back to unleashing American energy, not sitting out of our strategic preserve. Even worse, President Biden's abuse of our Strategic Petroleum Reserve has reduced our stockpile by more than 250 million barrels, jeopardizing our ability to respond to supply disruptions posed by natural disasters and other true emergencies. This includes selling millions of barrels of oil from our strategic reserve to adversarial countries, including China. And by prohibiting our strategic reserves from being sold to China, this legislation is a significant step toward restoring our energy security and providing needed relief for hardworking Americans. We have the energy, we have the ability to produce, and we need to move forward, and we need to ban Spro from going to China, and we need to move forward on American energy, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Lady from Washington reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield a minute and a half to the gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman.
Gentleman is recognized.
What political nonsense this bill is. It allows an American oil company to buy oil from the Spro on Monday and sell it to China on Tuesday, which means it's fine for them to see Spro oil going to China as long as an American oil company makes a little money out of it. And, of course, as the ranking member points out, it allows all the other oil in the country, 98% of it, of our exports to China, to go to China unchecked. If we were serious about lowering prices for the American consumer, we'd look at what the Republicans did in 2015 when they ended our ban on exports and insisted that that be added to the spending bill or they'd shut down the government. I had a bill introduced last month to ban American exports of oil when oil is selling for over $70 a barrel. And we need to ban the exports of natural gas when prices are too high for American consumers. Finally, this bill tries to attack the Biden administration use of the Spro to lower gas prices here, where it's been somewhat effective, and has made money for the United States Treasury. Let's legislate seriously to lower oil and natural gas prices for the American consumer, instead of simply insisting that if American Spro oil goes to China, an oil company has to be a middleman and make a little money off of it. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from New Jersey reserves.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just to correct the record, the language is very clear. If you look at subsection 2, such petroleum products will not be exported to the People's Republic of China. Pleased to yield 45 seconds. Gentleman from Florida, Mr. Bilirakis.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Congratulations on your chairmanship, and I look forward to working with you. I rise, Mr. Speaker, as this legislation, in support of this legislation. It's high time to stop the Biden administration from continuing to provide China with oil reserves from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Under the current administration, we have only seen a war against domestic energy production. As a band-aid to cover up the consequences of Biden's policies, resulting in unprecedented high energy prices, it chooses to draw down the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, a critical national security asset. Drawing down these reserves to cover up failed policies is wrong, but doing it and then selling that oil to China, our chief adversary, is un-American in my opinion. Thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlelady reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 3 minutes now to the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania, Ms. Houlihan, who's been working on this issue for some time.
Thank you very much. And thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. Today, we have an opportunity in this Congress to close a loophole that has been open since 2015, a loophole that enables our adversaries to purchase oil from our U.S. strategic petroleum reserves. There is a bill, indeed, to close that harmful loophole, a bill that will strengthen our national security, a bill that will signal to our fiercest adversaries that we will not bend a knee to those who threaten the safety of our allies and our service members, both here and abroad. I'm not talking about the bill that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have put forward today, but rather I'm talking about a bipartisan bill, my bipartisan bill, the Banning Oil Exports of Foreign Adversaries Act. We hear this phrase frequently in this chamber. It's that simple. So let's make this argument really simple, very, very simple. Our new majority has put forward a partisan bill that bans the sale of American oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve only to China. I have put forward a bipartisan bill with Representative Don Bacon and now with 44 others that would ban the sale not only to China, but also to North Korea, to Russia, to Iran, and to all other adversaries. It is modeled directly after similar and relevant legislation that I also introduced successfully in the NDAA regarding our critical minerals and rare earth element stockpiles. This bill, my bill, is stronger. It's bipartisan, and it has a chance in the Senate. This bill, the bill we're talking about today, is weaker. It's partisan, and it will unfortunately likely never see it pass the Senate's legislative graveyard. Mr. Speaker, it is very hard to hear my colleagues talk about returning to proper and regular order in the House, when in fact, if this very bill followed proper order and went through committee, we would likely be voting on a different piece of legislation today. My Republican colleagues know my background. I'm one of the most bipartisan members of this body and proudly served in the military for 13 years. And I'm here today because we have a chance to put our national security above our party politics. I call upon my colleagues, all of them, to join me in good faith to support the bipartisan Banning Oil Exports to Foreign Adversaries Act. Let's send this legislation through the proper order, strengthen it, and work together to get it signed into law. I urge my colleagues to look at the facts and to show service members and veterans that we put their safety and their sacrifice ahead of political gamesmanship. And before I conclude, I do want to thank my dear colleague, Representative Pallone, for his leadership and for having included this bill, my bill, in the Buy Low and Sell High Act of last Congress. Thank you, and I yield back.
Member from New Jersey reserves. Gentlelady from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Johnson.
Gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, today I rise in support of H.R. 22, led by our Energy and Commerce Committee Chairwoman Cathy McMorris Rodgers. Earlier this week, it was reported that after President Biden drained over 200 million barrels out of America's Strategic Petroleum Reserve, his Department of Energy is now rejecting multiple bids to refill it, saying that oil is too expensive. I mean, this is hard to believe. This administration, who has put a stranglehold on domestic production by canceling pipelines, reducing drilling, halting leases, and proposing burdensome regulations, they're now telling the American taxpayer, sorry, we depleted your national reserves, sold some of it to China, and now we won't refill it because it's too expensive. Aren't they the ones making oil more expensive? It's as if President Biden thinks the SPR is his strategic political reserve to be used as a Band-Aid for his failed energy policies. This legislation is a needed course correction in our national energy strategy, and I urge my colleagues to support it, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlelady reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield now a minute and a half to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Kastner, who is a leader on energy issues.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you to my friend from New Jersey. I rise to address a drafting error in this bill. The stated goal of H.R. 22 is to prevent aid to China and lower U.S. energy costs. As written, it's going to have the opposite effect. Let's run the math. In 2022, the SPR released about 210 million barrels of oil. Most of that was consumed domestically, a small fraction was exported, and a smaller fraction may have gone to China. During the same period, domestic oil producers exported more than 10 times that volume, so roughly 100 times the volume that was exported from that portion of our SPR that happens to be above ground. So the failure to include U.S. producers in the export prohibition means that this bill will do nothing to limit Chinese access to American oil, but since the SPR releases, as the majority notes, do reduce oil prices, curtailing our ability to use that tool will drive prices up and transfer wealth from U.S. consumers to U.S. producers in places like Bakersfield, California, as they sell higher-priced oil to China. Now, I cannot imagine that the Speaker intended to enrich his neighbors so that they could profit from Chinese oil sales, so I would encourage him to vote no. I'd also encourage anyone who seeks to prioritize United States access to United States energy to oppose until we can make the necessary corrections to this bill. Yield back.
Back. Gentleman from New Jersey reserves. Gentlelady from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to yield half a minute to Dr. Bouchon, gentleman from Indiana.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak in favor of the Protecting America's Strategic Petroleum Reserve from China Act. Under the Biden administration, we've seen a continuous assault on American energy that has killed jobs, increased our dependency on foreign energy sources, and caused energy costs to soar. In an attempt to lower energy prices, the administration has sold millions of barrels of petroleum from our strategic reserve, depleting our own supply and helping China to build the world's largest crude oil reserve. This must stop. I call on all my colleagues to join me in voting for this legislation to stop the Secretary of Energy from selling any more petroleum products from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to China. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlelady reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Cicilline.
Gentleman is recognized.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I rise today to oppose H.R. 22, the Protecting America's Strategic Petroleum Reserve from China Act. Let's get one thing straight. The reason we're here today considering this bill is because Republicans in Congress voted in 2015 to repeal a 40-year ban on the export of crude oil, including to our foreign adversaries. Despite this being a problem of their own making, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle seem more interested in playing political games with our country's energy security than offering concrete, effective solutions for the American people. When Vladimir Putin's brutal invasion of Ukraine and big oil's unchecked corporate greed caused gas prices to spike last year, the Biden administration took decisive action to lower prices for working families by releasing oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Not only did this move help protect the wallets of my constituents and Americans all across this country, reports also indicate that our government returned a nearly $4 billion profit on these sales. So if my Republican colleagues would like to get serious about standing up to our adversaries, I'd be happy to consider such proposals. But I cannot support this piecemeal legislation drafted for the purpose of scoring cheap political points rather than actually solving the problem of high energy costs. I urge my colleagues to vote no, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New Jersey reserves. Gentlelady from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Carter.
Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
I thank the gentlelady for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of H.R. 22 because there's nothing strategic about an empty strategic petroleum reserve. What's worse than not having a strategic reserve is selling it off to adversaries so they can build their own. That's exactly what's been happening over the past 2 years. While our SPR has been depleted in an attempt to cover up the failed energy policies of this administration, China is taking advantage by building up their own reserve. The worst part is that their buildup has come from the U.S. reserves. Let me repeat this. President Biden has sold our valuable strategic petroleum reserves to China while Americans face the highest energy prices in a generation and a federal government that has failed to adequately address it by unleashing our own energy potential. And every barrel sold to China makes that decision even more damaging. I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 22 to prevent the administration from selling any SPR products to the CCP or related entities. Stop the attacks on American energy, unleash it, make us energy independent. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlelady reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. Huffman.
Gentleman from California is recognized.
I thank the gentleman from New Jersey. And, Mr. Speaker, I rise to point out to my colleagues some context and facts that are totally missing from this debate. Exports of oil from the SPRO, regardless of destination, were not a problem before 2015. Many of us were here, and we remember exactly why that 40-year policy of the United States, a ban on crude oil exports, changed. It changed because that year, a Republican-controlled Congress insisted on lifting the export ban. And the Republicans in charge at that time refused to consider an amendment that was offered by our friend and former colleague, Representative Gene Green. That amendment would have required exporters to have a permit, finding that their export of crude oil was consistent with the national interest. Republicans did not create any restrictions on the destination of oil exported from our strategic reserves or any other source. If Republicans had not lifted that export ban, we would not have this problem. If Republicans hadn't blocked Representative Green's amendment from even being considered on the floor of the House, we would not have this problem. And instead, we are left with a Republican messaging bill, which purports to address a small part of the problem while ignoring the much bigger problem that they created back in 2015. If my friends across the aisle were truly concerned with U.S. oil exports going to China, they'd put a more serious measure forward. At the very least, they would block not just some small amount of petroleum from the SPRO, but the sale of all crude oil exports to China, which includes much larger volumes outside of the SPRO. In the international market, we don't know where crude oil ends up once it hits the global marketplace. That's the way it works. Sales to entities with connections to China may not go to China. Sales to entities with no connection to China may go straight to China. That's just how it works. And the fact is, the only way that we can be sure that U.S. crude doesn't end up in the hands of foreign entities of concern is to reinstate that crude oil export ban. I agree with my friends across the aisle. We shouldn't be exporting our strategic oil reserves to China. I just wish they hadn't gotten into this mess in the first place, and I wish they'd put forth a more serious bill now. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New Jersey reserves. Gentlelady from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Duncan.
I want to congratulate the lady from Washington on her chairmanship. You know, before the Biden administration's war on American energy, America was increasingly dominant in energy production, producing a surplus. Exceeding demand usually means that you can have lower prices because you're providing supply that exceeds demand. And then when we have more supply, we can export. We can export our allies at prices that actually compete with the OPEC cartel on the open market. That is what American energy dominance can do. But my colleagues on the other side of the aisle want to keep pushing green energy initiatives, wind and solar. And I think those are groovy technologies, but guess what? You cannot export renewable energy. You can't export oil and gas. To lower prices and increase stability for our friends in Europe, they're more reliant on Vladimir Putin for their energy. But you know what? For political purposes, President Biden sold off a strategic asset of this nation. He started dumping oil out of the SPOR, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, put it out there so that China could buy it, and China did buy it. This was an American asset. You know what? This bill that prohibits that oil from being sold to China and other adversaries makes sense, but the Democrat talking points make none. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlelady reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
And Mr. Speaker, I yield 3 minutes now to the gentlewoman from Texas, a member of our committee, Ms. Fletcher.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Energy security is a key component of our national security. Our energy exports have a security impact around the world, as they do here at home. And that's why I'm disappointed this morning to hear many of my friends across the aisle criticizing and blaming President Biden for taking action to lower gas prices for American consumers and to weaken Russia's ability to fund its unconscionable and unjustified war that is unprovoked against Ukraine by selling oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. The SPR is a critical foreign policy tool and energy security tool, and it has been for more than 40 years. The SPR was created for this precise purpose, for this moment that we are living in. And these recent sales, like every sale of crude in the U.S., are made on the open market to any entity wishing to purchase it. The effective utilization of the SPR has successfully lowered costs at the pump for Americans over the last year. In December, the Wall Street Journal reported that the U.S. government made roughly $4 billion in profits last year from the sale of crude oil out of the SPR. And this is an important point to remember because it is the direct work of this body. In 2015, the Energy and Commerce Committee, under Republican leadership, lifted the 40-year ban on crude oil exports. Now, I wasn't here at the time, but if I had been, I would have supported my Republican colleagues in that effort to acknowledge the global free market for the commodity and the importance of ensuring America's energy security and leadership. But it isn't right to complain now, for those who support free trade in oil and for those who voted for it then, to complain that the system worked as it was intended to. The oil from the SPR was put on the global market, which increased supply and brought prices down here at home. Some of the oil, sold by design onto the global market, made its way to China. This was not an unforeseen consequence. The then majority on the Energy and Commerce Committee explicitly rejected a proposal by a Democratic member of the committee at the time, Mr. Green from Houston, to license the export of crude oil the way we license LNG exports, which requires the Department of Energy to approve the sales. Requiring DOE approval on crude sales could have prevented the sales that are now of concern. That said, I appreciate that this is a step toward addressing those concerns, but I am also concerned that this alone is insufficient and we need a more robust mechanism to address any sales of concern. Certainly, my colleagues on both sides of the aisle would be concerned about sales to North Korea or Iran or other adversaries. That's why in the last Congress, I supported my colleague from Pennsylvania, Chrissy Houlihan's bipartisan bill that would have closed the loophole to allow the sale or export of oil from the SPR to foreign adversaries. There's still work to do here, and I hope that moving forward, we can work together to craft smart energy policy that enhances our energy security and best serves the American people. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from New Jersey reserves. Gentlelady from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Utah, member of the committee, Energy and Commerce, Mr. Curtis.
Gentleman from Utah is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of H.R. 22. This morning I've listened very carefully to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle talk about this bill, many of which I have great respect for, their expertise in energy. But I've heard terms like political games, partisan, and while this may be their perspective, I wish for just a moment that we could transport all of us to my district to see the perspective there, which is one of great hypocrisy. On the one hand, instead of utilizing the vast American resources we cleanly produce, including in Utah, the president chose to use this country's strategic reserve to try to lower prices. On the other hand, in fact, the president did this while attacking energy jobs in Utah by suspending energy development on federal lands and raising the royalty to produce oil, two contributing factors to rising gas prices. Not only did this release from the reserve barely make a dent in the cost of gas and weaken our national security, it also directly strengthened our number one geopolitical adversary, China. Under no circumstances should our reserve be used to fund our adversaries, regardless of our views in this chamber on the use of the reserve. by the Biden administration, we should all agree our emergency supplies shouldn't be sent to our adversaries. I yield my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlelady reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
The gentlewoman, I yield now 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Gentlelady from Texas is recognized.
I thank the chairman very much for his leadership and recognition that when we speak about this legislation and the question of blocking the utilization of the petroleum reserve during times of crisis, we must raise a question. Obviously, having experienced a big freeze in Houston, Texas, in the state of Texas, where 151 people died, we had to face the question of a very poor energy system, a lack of access to fossil fuel, I must admit, a frozen nuclear system, and unprepared in terms of alternative energy. It was a freeze that we had never experienced in Texas. The idea of the utilization of the petroleum reserve, for me, is a national security issue. And this legislation literally says, if the president has the need and necessity to protect the American people, it will not be allowed. So, Mr. Speaker, I have to rise in opposition, even coming from what has been called previously the energy capital of the world. But what we want to be in Houston, and I believe the nation, is a multidiscipline recognizing that there is a climate crisis, but at the same time recognizing the importance of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve for, in fact, the necessities of the president to be able to provide for this nation. The American people are listening. They want an executive who can make decisions that will block the Russians from absolutely crippling us. They want a president who can utilize this reserve. And so today I stand against this legislation because it baffles me as to how we can undermine the President of the United States in serving the American people and providing for energy relief when necessary. With that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman reserves. Gentlelady from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the lady from Arizona, member of the Committee, Energy and Commerce, Ms. Lesko.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of H.R. 22. This administration's war on American energy has sent energy costs through the roof. While this administration has continued to shift blame for the rising prices, President Biden is draining our strategic petroleum reserve, meant for emergencies, by selling off some of these reserves in a Band-Aid solution for his policy failures. Since May of last year, the Biden administration has sold off 1 million barrels of oil per day until after the midterm elections. Thanks to President Biden's actions, our oil reserve is now at the lowest point in 40 years. Yet this administration has no plan to unleash American energy production to replenish our emergency oil supply and reduce prices. And to make matters even worse, while the Biden administration is selling off our emergency oil reserve at an unprecedented rate, some of these barrels of oils have gone to communist China. That's right, our emergency oil supply is now in the hands of Chinese Communist Party. We are exporting a total of 300,000 barrels of oil per day to China. In part because of the Biden administration, China, not the U.S., has the largest government-controlled stockpile of oil in the world. With this legislation, House Republicans are delivering on our promise to restore our nation's energy security and better protect our national security. This legislation stops the Biden administration from selling any more of our emergency supply to the Chinese Communist Party. House Republicans will continue to stand up to China and stop the Biden administration from ceding our energy security to our enemies. I yield back.
Yields back. Gentlelady from Washington reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, may I inquire how much time remains on both sides?
Gentleman from New Jersey has 5.5 minutes.
And the other side?
Gentlelady from Washington has 11.5 minutes.
Well, then I'll reserve at this time.
Gentleman from New Jersey reserves. Gentlelady from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to yield a minute to the House Majority Leader, Mr. Scalise, also a longtime member of the House Energy and Commerce Committee.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the chair of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, my dear friend, Ms. McMorris Rodgers, for yielding and for bringing this legislation, H.R. 22, to the floor, such an important piece of legislation to start standing up for America's national security. Because if you think about the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, just think of the first word in that name, strategic. It's there for America's national security. SPRO, as it's referred to, first of all, raiding SPRO, which President Biden has done over and over and over again, depleting 40% of our national security strategic reserve, not to move world oil prices. As you can see, Mr. Speaker, multiple times, starting in November of 2021, President Biden has raided SPRO because he's attacked American energy. As he attacked American energy, starting on his first day in office, the price of oil and gasoline at the pump subsequently has risen dramatically, crushing middle-class families. So he started feeling the heat. Now, his answer should have been reverse the failed policies that are dramatically increasing gas prices by crushing American energy. But no, that's not what President Biden did, because the extremists on the left don't want that. They won't allow him to do it. So then he turned to SPRO, and he said, well, maybe we can just try to trick the American people by raiding SPRO. So he did. And when he raided it, what happened? You got a sugar high for about a week, and boom, the price started going back up again. Because the world markets recognized President Biden has taken American energy off the market. We, by the way, Mr. Speaker, we are the only country in the world that can produce massive quantities of oil that is a free market country. The rest of the countries that have an abundant supply are cartels. OPEC, Russia, Iran, Venezuela, they want a high price. The only check and balance to high prices of oil is a free market producing America. And by the way, if you want to hide behind the Green New Deal and global warming and whatever other name they attach to it, climate change, they change the name every couple of years because the American people figure out that all it is an attack on American energy. And so the price keeps going up because we're shutting off the cleanest producing country in the world. You want to lower carbon emissions in the world? Produce more oil in America. It's not just about creating more jobs. It's not just about our national security, Mr. Speaker. It's about actually reducing global emissions. Because China, as this bill addresses President Biden selling our strategic reserves to China, China's building about a coal plant a week, a new coal plant every week, dramatically increasing carbon emissions while President Biden shuts down American manufacturing and production, shuts down oil, which, by the way, we were reducing emissions during those times when we were producing energy. So again, over and over again, raided SPRO, raided SPRO, raided SPRO, the price kept going up. What went down is America's national security. And that's what we're getting to the heart of here. 40% of our reserves. Now, you've got two different ways to get energy. We can actually produce it. As the moniker right above the Speaker's rostrum says, let us develop our natural resources. We've got natural resources. We've got the best technology in the world. We can produce it cleaner than anybody else in the world. And so as long as we're producing energy it actually can lower the cost. And so we don't just produce enough for ourselves because, by the way, if we weren't allowed to export energy, then you would see a decrease in production. You would see a decrease in exploration. It's like a farmer. If a farmer can only produce and sell in America, they're going to plant a lot less because they can't have access to world markets. You want to have access to world markets. But you want to also have a reserve in case, not in case you have a failed policy, as is what we're seeing with President Biden. You want a reserve in case there's a natural disaster. If a hurricane hits the Gulf of Mexico, as we've seen, it actually spikes the price. So you have a brief disruption, and you want a reserve to go and fill that need. If you have some kind of national security emergency, like they did in the 1970s, by the way, when SPRO was created. That's when we created this reserve for our country, when cartels controlled world oil markets, because we didn't have the technology to access like we do today. We didn't have fracking technology. We didn't have the ability to go 5,000 feet in the deep waters of the Gulf of Mexico to find billion-barrel reserves like we do today. And so the cartels controlled everything. Lines at the pump. You had to have an even-numbered license plate to get gasoline on a certain day. That was the 1970s, and so Congress created SPRO for our national security. Mr. Speaker, the House is not in order.
Gentleman is correct. The House is not in order. Please take your conversations off the floor. Gentleman may proceed.
Thank you. I understand a little history lesson might help people recognize how we got here. It's not by accident that we got here. We should want, as Congress, to be able to work together to fix this problem, to address the fact that prices have gone up, not just for gasoline at the pump. When people are heating their homes in a cold winter, the price shouldn't be that high. And by the way, we were also, by exporting energy, helping our friends around the world so we don't have to be dependent on oil from other places or natural gas. So Putin, as was the case in the buildup to Afghanistan, Putin was making about $700 million a day, Mr. Speaker, selling his oil to America and Europe because President Biden shut off American supply. No reason that should have happened. But that's what got us here. What can get us out? First, let me remind you what else got us here, because they're trying to blame everybody else under the sun. It was Putin's fault. It's the oil company's fault. It's the weather's fault. It's President Biden's fault. Day one he started mountains of rules and regulations. These aren't laws passed by Congress, by the way. These are rules and regulations that have come out of the Biden administration just in the last 2 years, attacking American energy, not foreign countries. President Biden was okay with pipelines from Russia to Europe, but he said no on day one to a pipeline from Canada to America. So all of these actions had a cost. The cost is dramatic prices at the pump for hardworking families, crushing the lowest income families amongst us. What agencies, by the way, are represented here? Department of Energy went after American Energy. Department of Energy Regulatory Commission. The Securities and Exchange Commission, through woke policies, going after American energy. The Department of Agriculture, yes, went after American energy in these rules and regs. The Council on Environmental Quality. The Department of State, that gets to the Keystone Pipeline. The Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Justice, and yes, the Department of Interior, all represented right here in rules and regulations that crushed American energy, making us more dependent on foreign countries and leading to President Biden raiding our strategic petroleum reserve, 40%, making our country less safe. This foolishness has to end. We can solve this problem. Now, Ms. McMorris Rodgers and her committee, they actually have real ideas about how to solve this problem. The good news is, Mr. Speaker, under this majority, we're going to be bringing bills through committee to the floor to fix this problem. Now, on the other side today, you hear them talking about this magic bill. They've got a bill. Boy, if we just killed this bill, because they want to keep selling our strategic reserves to China, 950,000 barrels already that President Biden has sold to China. But they've got some magic answer. My question would be, where was that magic answer 2 years ago, 2 months ago, 2 weeks ago when they were in the majority? They had the House, Senate, and White House, and just, I guess, in the last 2 weeks, they finally figured out the answer. because they surely didn't pass that to the president 2 weeks ago, 2 months ago, or 2 years ago. What they did do is they brought mountains and mountains of regulation to crush American energy. And then Biden gets on a plane, it called Air Force One. We've checked it. There are no solar panels on the wings of Air Force One. It actually uses jet fuel. And he flies to Saudi Arabia and begs Saudi princes to produce more energy because he shut down America's energy production. No leases, no pipelines, no permits. He's done all those things, and it led to higher prices. He didn't have to get on Air Force One and fly thousands of miles back and forth. Who knows what the carbon footprint of that is? I'd love to see the press dig into that because they love talking about carbon footprints for other things. He didn't have to get on Air Force One at all. He could have picked up the phone and called Port Fourchon in South Louisiana and said, will you produce more energy in America? Cleaner, more efficient, better jobs than anywhere else in the world. He didn't do that. It's time we get smart policies. It's time we have some common sense in our energy policy so we stop crushing those middle-class families to sell our oil to China, not just our oil, our reserves. This is our piggy bank in case there's a disaster. He's depleted 40% of it, and he'd keep reducing it to mask his failed policies. Let's get the policy right and start fighting for those hardworking families who are suffering because of this. Let's pass this legislation. Let's keep going to work for those families, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from Washington reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself 1 minute. I listened to the majority leader, and I want to stress that history is not on his side. The fact of the matter is that the Republicans created this problem by lifting the ban on the export of crude oil to China and the rest of the world when they were in the majority. And this bill does nothing to solve the problem. Only 2% of the oil that's exported to China comes from the Spro. The other 98%, even if this bill passes, which it won't in the Senate, will still allow the other 98% of crude oil to go to China. And the consequence of the Republican policy was to destroy jobs at American refineries, including my home state of New Jersey, because they allowed the crude oil to be exported, and as a result, a lot of the refineries closed, and we lost jobs here. So don't tell me that this is a bill that's going to help our country, help jobs. It's just the opposite. It is just masking the reality, which is they want to continue to sell oil to China, to Russia, to Iran, and to all our adversaries. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlelady from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to yield to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, a member of the Energy and Commerce Committee, Dr. Joyce.
I thank the gentlewoman for yielding, and I congratulate her on her historic leadership position.
Gentlemen, we'll suspend. Gentlelady, how many minutes?
1.5 minutes, please.
1.5. Thank you.
Again, I thank the gentlewoman for yielding, and I congratulate her for her historic leadership position. Mr. Speaker, our nation and our national security has always been tied to our ability to utilize the resources that we have right here in America to remain free. The energy resources that are underneath the feet of my constituents were vital to the production and fueling of the tanks, the planes, and the ships that gave Americans the advantages that we needed to win World War II. And now, the Chinese Communist Party threatens free nations with oppression. The Biden administration has allowed our strategic petroleum reserves to be sold to the Chinese companies for political purposes. Instead of approving new leasing permits, Biden delayed new drilling projects and canceled on day one the Keystone XL pipeline. Instead of incentivizing companies to use the resources that we have in Pennsylvania, Biden targeted American energy producers with new regulations that made natural gas and oil more expensive for American families. Selling away our strategic petroleum reserve for political gain has left our nation less safe and our economy less secure. 950,000 barrels of American strategic petroleum to the Chinese Communist Party? This boggles the American mind. It is time to refill our strategic reserves. It is time to stop risking our national security to score cheap political points. I urge all of my colleagues to vote yes on this important legislation. Thank you, and I yield the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Lady from Washington reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'll continue to reserve because they have more time on their side.
Gentlelady from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to yield to the gentleman from Ohio, leader on energy issues, new member of the committee, Mr. Balderson. 1 minute.
How much time?
1 minute.
1 minute. Gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Madam Chair, and I look forward and I'm honored and blessed to be able to serve with you. Instead of supporting American energy producers and reversing their disastrous energy policies, the Biden administration decided to drain our energy reserves to the lowest levels since 1983. So who benefited from this decision to drain these reserves? The Chinese Communist Party, now the largest government-controlled petroleum reserve in the world. In fact, this administration transferred 900,000 barrels from our stockpile to a subsidiary of Chinese Communist Party-owned China Petroleum and Chemical Corp. H.R. 22, sponsored by Madam Chair McMorris Rodgers, bars the Secretary of Energy from selling any of America's petroleum reserves to an entity affiliated with the CCP or entity that intends to export it to China. Energy security is national security. House Republicans are fighting to ensure one of our greatest geopolitical challenges. China does not benefit from this administration's misguided energy policies. I urge passage of H.R. 22, the Protecting America's Strategic Petroleum Reserve from China Act, and yield back, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Thank you. Great job, Troy.
Lady from Washington, reserve.
I reserve.
Gentleman from New Jersey.
I continue to reserve until we're prepared to close.
Very well.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Stauber.
Thank you.
Gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Chairwoman. I rise in support of H.R. 22. The bottom line is, do we sell our strategic petroleum reserves to China or not? The answer is we should never sell 1 ounce of strategic petroleum reserve to the communist country of China. Remember, Joe Biden, as a candidate and on day 1, declared war on American energy by shutting down the XL Keystone pipeline. He still commits to the war on American energy. We in America are paying way more for energy than we should because of the policies of this administration. So this H.R. 22, Madam Chair, is an easy one. The United States of America should not sell 1 ounce of our strategic petroleum reserve to the communist country of China. And I rise in strong support of H.R. 22, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back.
I
Lady
reserve.
from Washington. Gentleman from New Jersey reserves. Gentlelady from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Texas, new member of the Energy and Commerce Committee, Mr. Weber.
Thank you, ma'am. Mr. Speaker, I have paid attention to this SPR since 2008 when I got elected to the Texas House. 60% of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve is housed in my district. I'm pleased to announce that the Independent Petroleum Association of America endorses this legislation put forth by House Republicans aimed at reining in the administration's misuse of the SPRO, or SPR as we call it. SPR was not intended to be used as a political play tool to bring down gasoline prices in election year. Next thing you know, the president will be giving away free college tuition. Oh, he did that too. Listen, this is only a Band-Aid on the overarching situation. The long-term solution is to enhance rather than hinder America's leadership in natural gas and oil production. Our true domestic natural gas and oil reserves, from production to pipelines and through the supply chain, are ready to work, and Republicans' legislations put them and our American allies at the forefront. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
I yield myself 30 seconds, Mr. Speaker. It's certainly no surprise that the oil industry would support this bill, because this bill does absolutely nothing to prevent them from selling to China, to Russia, and all our adversaries. Only 2% of the oil that's sold to China comes from the SPRO. So they'll be able to continue to sell to whoever they please. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlelady from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Van Drew. 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from New Jersey.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairwoman. We're very proud of you and look forward to working with you, and thank you for yielding. You guys got to be kidding me. Seriously. You were in control. You had the House. You had the Senate. You had the presidency. If you thought there were any good bills or good ideas to stop this, or bills that were better than anything we're putting forward, why didn't you do them? You had the control. You didn't need us for a whole lot of other things. You voted and rammed things through that we didn't want, rammed things through that were radical, and yet this common sense type of legislation, nothing happened. You can't be serious. That's a bad argument. Since there's been one-party rule in Washington, Democratic rule, Republicans were forced to watch President Biden drain more than 250 million barrels, nearly 40% of our petroleum reserve. This puts our national security at risk. It puts the American people at risk. For our military, what will they do if they need the petroleum reserve? For our Americans, what will they do when natural disasters strike and their town needs the petroleum reserve? For our rescue and emergency personnel, what will they do if they need the petroleum reserve? Why would anyone ever vote against this bill? Maybe if you want to lower gas prices temporarily for political gains, you would oppose this bill. But make a choice. Do what's right and vote for this bill.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlelady from Washington.
I reserve.
Reserves.
All right.
I reserve, Mr. Speaker, until we close.
Gentleman from New Jersey reserves. Gentlelady from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to yield to the lady from Texas. 1 minute, Monica De La Cruz.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of American energy independence and the oil and natural gas workers of South Texas. This act is a crucial step to holding China accountable and repositioning the United States as a global energy leader. It is essential that we recover our energy independence and stand up for Texas's workers who have unfairly suffered as a result of this administration's misguided policies that have emboldened regimes like China and Venezuela's narco dictatorship. The decision to prioritize foreign energy over our own puts American workers, our industries, and our country at a disadvantage. Protecting American energy will strengthen both our economic and national security. I fully stand committed to fighting for all the natural gas and oil workers in South Texas and across our nation. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentlelady from Washington reserves.
Again, I'll reserve until we close.
Okay. Gentleman from New Jersey reserves. Gentlelady from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to yield 45 seconds to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Mills.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I had prepared a speech today to talk about the support that I come to rise for H.R. 22 and the protection of our strategic petroleum reserves. But after hearing my colleagues on the left, it's very simple. They don't care about unleashing American energy, us getting to energy dominance, to ensuring that we have the global currency. They care about defending the Chinese and the CCP. That's why they've continued to try and prevent us from being able to sell our strategic petroleum reserves for China. That's why they tried to stop us from putting together a subcommittee that would have been a select subcommittee to go after the CCP and their malign activities. Mr. Speaker, it is very clear They do not want to go to an America First agenda. They do not want to protect America. They do not want to unleash American energy for the American people to get our costs under control. They want to continue to protect the Communist China Party and the Chinese themselves. I rise in protection not just in support of H.R. 22, but of the American people and the American workers. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlelady from Washington.
Mr. Speaker, may I inquire as to the time remaining?
Gentlelady from Washington has 3 minutes.
Thank you. I reserve.
Gentleman from New Jersey has 4 minutes. Gentlelady reserve.
Is the gentlewoman prepared to close?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Fallon.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 30 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today as a co-sponsor of Protecting America's Strategic Petroleum Reserve from China Act. China should not be the beneficiary of the Biden administration's foolhardy abuse of the SPR. It was at 695 million barrels, and it goes down to 371. That's halved, while the Chinese Communist Party has in reserve nearly 8 billion. This is foolhardy. This is an excellent piece of legislation, and I urge swift passage. Let's put America first. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlelady from Washington.
I reserve.
Recognized. She reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey.
Mr. Speaker, I'll yield myself 30 seconds. The gentleman talks about how China has built up its reserve, its petroleum reserve, is because you, when you were in the majority, stopped the ban on export, and they used that opportunity to build up their reserves. This has nothing to do with the SPRO. 98% of the oil that's exported to China is not from the SPRO. So they used the opportunity since 2015 when you lifted the ban to build up their petroleum reserves on your watch. I reserve the balance of my.
Gentleman reserves. Members are reminded to address their remarks to the chair. By the order of the House. Okay. Gentlelady from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Lawler.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Bottom line is America needs to be energy independent. We should not be relying on foreign governments. We should not be relying on China, least of all. 60% of New Yorkers, for instance, rely on natural gas. We need to expand our energy portfolio. We need to increase domestic production of energy. We need to protect our reserves. We should not be engaging in the type of behavior that the administration has with respect to China, and we should continue to do everything we can to reduce the cost of energy here in America and increase our production. That has to be the goal at all times. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back.
Prepared to close.
Gentlelady reserves and prepared to close.
I'm prepared to close, and I'll yield myself such time as I may consume, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I find myself compelled to point out that listening to Republican arguments today, you'd think that they have been sacred stewards of the SPRO, and that couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, when Republicans had the majority in both the House and the Senate from 2015 to 2019, they passed 6 bills, none of which had anything to do with energy, that rated the SPRO for a total of over 260 million barrels of crude. Now the Republicans stand here criticizing President Biden's usage of the SPRO, and it's laughable. President Biden's usage of the SPRO has helped lower gas prices by nearly $1.80 per gallon since their peak. And while the Republicans want to pretend they're tough on China, it's really the opposite that's true. Last year, the Biden administration was forced to sell 20 million barrels from the SPRO under one of those laws that I mentioned earlier that passed a Republican-controlled Congress. The Republicans did include any restrictions, no restrictions or stipulations on that sale, And as a result, the administration was forced to sell to the highest bidders, including a firm owned by the People's Republic of China. Now, again, I'm going to stress in closing, the Republicans caused China to have a huge petroleum reserve by lifting the ban on crude oil in 2015 when they were in the majority. We would not have this problem.
The House is not in order. Please take your conversations off the floor. Gentlemen may resume.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Prior to 2015, when the Republicans lifted the ban on exports of crude oil, we had that ban in place for 40 years. And then in 2015, they came in and they lifted the ban. So they caused this problem. And during the Trump administration, the amount of crude oil that was sold to China was unbelievable. As a result, the petroleum reserve, increased significantly in China. They took advantage of the situation. Now, if you really wanted to do something today, first of all, you'd say that the SPRO should not only be banned by selling oil from the SPRO to China, but you should say that you can't sell it to Russia, you can't sell it to Iran, you can't sell it to North Korea, you can't sell it to our adversaries, which is exactly what the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania, Ms. Houlihan's bill, does on a bipartisan basis. But even beyond that, you could simply say no crude oil should be sold at all, exported at all, or certainly not exported to our adversaries. And that's not what's happening here. So this is a problem that was created by the Republicans, and they pretend that they're doing something about it today, but in fact they are not. And the reason is because they're with the big oil, they're with the special interests that want to sell this crude oil, continue to sell it overseas, and they don't care that it goes to our adversaries. That's the bottom line. This bill is not going to accomplish anything. And so I would urge my colleagues to vote no on the legislation. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Gentlelady from Washington is recognized to close.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Leadership matters. American leadership matters. You can't be a diplomatic power without being a military power. You can't be a military power without being an economic power. And you cannot be an economic power without energy. In order to reverse the damage to our energy security and our global leadership, we must flip the switch and unleash American energy production. We need to stop the Biden administration from wasting our strategic reserves. It's time to cut the red tape and expand energy production here at home, modernize our infrastructure, and create new opportunities for jobs and economic development. The Democrats suggest that if the bills included Iran, Russia, North Korea, that they would support it. The fact of the matter is, those are the countries this administration has gone to. They've gone to OPEC, Iran, and Russia, and actually asked them to produce more oil. Ladies and gentlemen, I look forward to the passage of this bill today, and I am eager to work with my colleagues on additional solutions to make energy more affordable, more reliable. It is America that is leading in clean, reliable, renewable, affordable energy, and it is so important to energy dominance. It's important to American leadership. It's important to our economy. It's important to every person in this country that has been living with record high energy prices. Every time they go to the gas station to fill up over the last couple of years, they have been experiencing record high energy prices. Ladies and gentlemen, we are prepared to lead. We want to unleash American energy, unleash clean American energy jobs. This is important to our national security. It's important to our economic security. I urge everyone to vote yes. Pass H.R. 22. It's just the beginning. There's more to come. With that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back the balance of her time. All time for debate has expired. Pursuant to House Resolution 5, the previous question is ordered on the bill. The question is on engrossment and third reading of the bill. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. Third reading.
A bill to prohibit the Secretary of Energy from sending petroleum products from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to China and for other purposes.
The question is on passage of the bill. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The bill is passed. Gentleman from New Jersey.
On that, I would ask for
recognized.
the yeas and nays.
Gentleman has requested. The yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. Sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their vote by electronic device. This will be a 15-minute vote.